Was that a yes or a no? Okay, good evening. Welcome to UPARS Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the director for UPARS LA. Tonight we have a very special guest, a distinguished guest, Paul Stonehill. Paul is a former Jewish Soviet immigrant. He came to the United States in 1973, but he's had an interest in ufology since he was a child, and he's going to tell you about that tonight. Paul is he's very well written. He has written several books, co-authored with Philip Mantle, and he's brought one of those tonight with him, Russia's USO Secrets. So, we have UFOs, but here in Los Angeles, Santa Monica Bay, we have quite a few sightings of USOs, and Alex has interviewed witnesses who have seen very, very strange craft come out of the ocean and strange things going on. There's even rumors of an underwater base out there. But Paul's here tonight. He's going to share with us his research on Soviet ufology. And in fact, the first MUFON meeting I ever went to, way back when, this is probably in the late 90s, Paul was the speaker. And he was talking about, I remember distinctly, speaking about this lake somewhere in the Soviet Union. There are these aliens, these aquatic aliens that were being observed. It's a very, very fascinating case. Maybe he'll share that with you tonight. But that stuck out in my mind. I was like, wow, that's amazing. Anyway, Paul's here tonight, and I'd like you to give him a warm welcome. Thank you. Let's put this on you.
Either way.
Okay, good.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Take that off the
Take.
Okay.
This is for him?
Yeah, that's for him. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll hold this.
Okay, very good. I can remove this now. You're not so obstructed.
Good. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. And I'll tell you as much as I can. Today, I'll show you my books and so forth. But I just wanted to mention, just like you, Pars, my research is not limited only to UFOs and USOs, but also to other aspects of the paranormal history of Eurasia. That would include Russia, China, Central Asia, and so forth. And I'll show you a way you can look at my latest research, because I do quite a lot. I'll show you some of my books. They've been published in different languages. Paranormal Mysteries of Eurasia. It's not a new book, but it has a lot of other subjects, not only UFOs. Those are the latest. For you to see my updated research of other aspects, just look at the YouTube channel, Paul Stonehill Paranormal Research. I think you will like it, and you will see aspects that are not only limited by geography of the USSR, Russia, and Eurasia. Quite many things take place in Los Angeles. I grew up here. I've traveled a lot and seen other countries, but we have a tremendous amount of paranormal phenomena in Los Angeles. And you'll see my work, especially two locations which I've been to for a number of years. My information, the one that I'll share from you, is not something I just read and do research on. I get it straight from Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia. They're very capable young researchers, and they do excellent work. We exchange information and research, and we go more. We do a few more things beyond that. Some of the background as I speak, I want you to understand where it's coming from. USSR, Russia, it's a different civilization from us in the United States, just like China is. And some of the background is important because, when a sighting takes place over Kansas, that's one thing. When it takes place or took place over, let's say, a Soviet secret military base or a secluded city, it was quite different. Too many things were involved in it. And you will be able to see it. Plus, secrecy was always a big part in the Russian history, and especially in the Soviet period. And people were afraid to report what they had seen sometimes. Sometimes they were not, and then they suffered for that too. So, I wanted to start with the USOs because it's one of the most interesting subjects. And you can see some of the images I have. For example, the one here, let's see if it shows. This is from, I believe, 1908, and it shows strange circles that engulf the area around vessels in the sea, especially in the Far East. Very interesting depiction, and nobody could explain what's going on. It's just not biological, what should I say, luminescence. It's something else. But also you can see photographs and depictions completed by Russian and Soviet naval personnel of UFOs and USOs. In 1716, there was a very unusual I should say, phenomenon over St. Petersburg, and it was reported by Dutch spies and diplomats and by Russian admiral. Two huge objects encountered each other over St. Petersburg. There was a lot of noise, scared the people around. It was an aerial battle, but it was so vicious and so vivid that special reports were made. And still nobody can explain. I mean, it's just like two jets fighting in today's skies. And there were other, the Baltic Sea, which was famous a few years ago because of an alleged object down at the bottom. Well, the Baltic Sea has had very interesting history. For example, in 1845, they found burning objects that couldn't be extinguished in the sea, in the Baltic Sea. And at the same time, there were other phenomena, as always. You know, whenever there's, like, for example, volcanic activity, UFOs were sighted. They described them differently in 1845, but that's what we had. Some of the interesting areas are the most forbidden even today. The submarine bases in the North Russia, in the Arctic areas, have been visited by UFOs persistently, regardless of, you know, precautions that the Soviet Navy had taken. There was a very sinister case in the Far East, in the Kamchatka, when a UFO jumped out from the waters, let's say, of the lake Karnotsky, and those who had observed it died. Most of them died. It was a very, very unusual death, but not, you know, only one survived. And that wasn't the only incident related to the very bad effects of UFOs/USOs. My latest research, I made a presentation about it a few times, and I spoke also on Coast to Coast. There's an island, and remember the name, Matua, in the Kuril Island chain. It's a very strange history. I will not go into all the details here. Suffice it to say that the Japanese were holding on to it for dear life, but they wouldn't shed one drop of blood when the Soviets finally came there in 1945. That island had been visited by Nazi submarines persistently. There's something inside the island. And the Russians came back after 17 years of absence and are reclaiming the territory. They brought archaeologists, they brought a few other experts, because there is something inside that island. They say 54 stories, city-like entity, maybe structures that cannot be explained. The air, you know, thermal airfield that functioned many years after Japan lost the island, and it's one of the latest mysteries around the Kuril Islands themselves. You can see some of the objects that are still found on the island, but more have been gone, maybe dropped into the volcano, but the Russians find it very difficult to get in. You know, could it be that there was a secret, you know, nuclear research possible? I mean, Nazi submarines were there quite often, and we don't know what they did. And this was after the, you know, collapse of Nazi Germany, but before Japan lost the war. Very, very interesting place. You could, you know, find remnants of Nazi Germany, some of the fragments of their history there too, still. And it's a volcanic island. There's another small island in 1983, if you remember, when the Korean air jet was shot down by the Soviet Air Force. That happened around this island. One of the most and best ecological places in the world. It also has underground Japanese structures, which has not been explored, and of course USOs and UFOs have been sighted there. Very important. This little island is a volcanic island not far from the very first one. I found reports recently about observation of underwater structures down below, like Atlantis-like structures that had been seen, I would say, in the 1980s. And somebody many years ago, before I knew anything like that, in Little Tokyo, asked me, a Japanese journalist, if I think that the famous Japanese tale about the young lady who came to Japan in a strange vehicle and was basically sent away. It was a very unusual vehicle. Some people say it looked like a UFO. I don't think so, but it's, you know, it's a very complicated story. Well, he asked me if I think that she came from that island, and I had no knowledge of what I know today. So the Japanese are very much interested in everything that's going on, even if they lost the territories to the USSR. And I think they know much more, of course, than they're saying. Some of the people, this is very important, that were engaged in the government-authorized USO, Unidentified Submersible Objects research in the Soviet Navy, they were scared. They had to do something. And they sent special teams of top military experts and engineers all over wherever the Soviet navies were present in the oceans of our planet. It was a very interesting research. They found a lot of things. Some of the phenomena I described in my book and elsewhere, I talked about it too, the so-called Quackery phenomenon, when the strange gigantic objects would encounter Soviet ships, but intangible objects. And they were afraid these were Americans. They found out later these were not the Americans. In 1985, about this research was suddenly shut down, disbanded, and whoever was involved were sent to other branches. Very interesting. We still don't know why they shut it down. And the phenomenon stopped, but not the USO phenomenon. They've seen it all over. One of the encounters they had was not far from the Philippines and some of the waters around Philippines. We'll get to that. That's very important. Just to show you that some of the top Soviet military people were involved. One of the reasons I became interested in UFOs, not only because I encountered somebody who had actual observation of a UFO over the Soviet Arctic back in 1930s, but also because of this magazine, which still exists in Russia. It was a very brave magazine, so to say, in the Soviet period, because it dared publish information about UFOs, and they suffered for that, but at least we could read about some of the unusual cases, and very interesting. Even some of the Soviet related cases, and I owe a lot to the magazine. Now, recently I talked about information that came from late Vice Admiral Matushkin. He was by the Novaya Zemlya archipelago. That's where they have secret nuclear tests. It's off limits, of course, to the foreigners, and one of the most secret areas in the Soviet Union. Well, they observed a gigantic X-shaped UFO, called USO, coming in and out of the waters. They made a report to the Soviet Academy of Sciences, as they should. Him and his officers, they never heard back. They had to make a report because throughout the Soviet armed forces from 1978 to 1991, there was a program, a secret military/academic research program to study UFOs. They couldn't call it UFOs, they called it anomalous aerial phenomena. It's even harder to say it in Russian, but you couldn't say UFO. You could mention it, but it wasn't liked by the government, so until 1989 the term UFO was not allowed to be used. Unless you wanted to denigrate them, to make fun of them and so forth, which they did in the media quite well. They had debunkers, they published Donald Manzel's book. It was very much liked, and all those Americans who made fun of UFO researchers were in fashion Soviet Union. Some of the more people involved and still are in the USO reports and investigations. Mr. Ajaja, he's still alive. He's probably almost in his 90s. Well, he was very prominent in the USO research. He pushed it. See, there are people who study and there are people who actually do and act, and because of his friendship with the former naval comrades, he got a job in the Soviet Navy to actually study USOs. That was after he was fired from his job because he wanted to talk about Bermuda Triangle. Well, the Communist Party officials, the local ones, didn't like it. So he was fired, but then he got the best job he could have. And he was pushing, and he actually was one of the people, no, he was the person that put wording in the so-called instruction to the armed forces on how to register those strange objects. He also tried to get the Soviet space program involved, and I trust he did. I trust he did because there were other incidents, we'll get to them, with the Soviet space program and USOs. In Ukraine, Balaklava, in Crimea, I still consider it Ukraine. It is Ukraine. And then there was a very unusual secret Soviet submarine case. Remember the name Balaklava, because if you look at my channel in a few weeks or so, you'll see something else related, another paranormal phenomena with Balaklava. But maybe the largest underground submarine base, the most secret one. Nobody knew about it outside of the city. And those who lived in the city couldn't really leave it. But they had a good life. They were very well, should I say, they had things that most of the Soviet population did not. Anyway, the UFOs have been seen throughout the secret Soviet years, because no matter the secrecy, UFOs and USOs do not care about it. They don't care about ideologies. They come as they want to. And the Soviets learned it. Chukotka. It's the closest Russian territory to the United States. There may be a few miles apart. And of course it's heavily fortified, but it's also a very desolate, secluded land. And I will present more about it in the future because there is a lot to say. But I have information about it in other books. All I want to let you know is that no matter how heavy fortified Russian Air Force bases are, UFOs are always there. There are very interesting objects on that peninsula, including unusual lake that is very close to Bermuda Triangle in the composition and the effects. And also ancient astronaut theories would find out interesting information about flying shamans going back thousands of years and a few other discoveries. If we go back to the Kuril Islands, and you can see where it is, Sea of Okhotsk, very important area. Look at the geographic location. Japan is there, China is not too far away, and all that turbulence right now in the South China Sea, it's not that far away. North Korea, of course, and there are bigger players than North Korea involved in that area. Very persistent UFO and USO reports. And not only that unusual phenomena, there is more. But just remember it, because there'll be more news coming, I think, soon. Kamchatka is yet another geographical piece to talk about, again, heavy Soviet and Russian army presence and heavy interest of Japanese intelligence and others in the territory. There was an interesting case. There is an area in Kamchatka which contains black sand. It's the best material for high-tech research, maybe even nanotechnology. Well, the Japanese intelligence was able to fool the Soviets to the extent that they leased this beach from them and brought sand to, amazed to see how the Soviet special forces were observing UFOs over the Caspian Sea. That's not far from Iran. It's also, not a stable area, and Russia has its own interests right now there. And they've seen interesting objects. And they were not American spy satellites, they know that. In 1978 is a very interesting year, and I'll mention it throughout my lecture. And there were observations, I'll limit to my part of the world, let's say, to Eurasia. There have been observations all over, and the Soviet Navy has presented them, like this one from the Pacific Ocean. And we will learn a little bit more about 1978 as we go along, because 78 and 79 were the years of some of the most prominent UFO observation waves in the Soviet Union, and the people who had observed them were trained military specialists, meteorologists, and so forth. I'm not even speaking about civilian reports. Some of the Soviet submarines involved in the UFO observations, and not only submarines. This used to be a cruise ship, Shatarustaveli, excuse me. And once there was a UFO that flew over it, and it affected everybody's watches. And, they were not all Soviet watches that would break apart, but, everybody's, including the sea captain, they stopped working. There were some other interesting effects. The ship doesn't exist anymore, but we still have information about that sighting. In the area of northern Russia, very interesting. This is next to Finland, and some of the territories used to be Finland, but it doesn't matter. What you have is the persistent UFO cases and USO observations in the lakes of that area. And even today, you still can see reports about them. Something definitely is taking place at the bottom of some of the lakes there, Ladoga and a few others. And we have information that goes back to the recorded history. And even to in 1938, there was a case in Lake Kurkiyoki, for example, of an object that just dived into the waters, and it was a very interesting case. As we speak about northern Russia, I wanted to tell you about this area. The Kola Peninsula is strategic Russian territory, and Nazis did their best to try to take it away from the Soviet Union, but they failed. UNINERVA, the Nazi German Institute for the Study of Paranormal, let's put it that way. Not too accurate, but that's what they did. They were trying to get there and found out some of the ritualistic objects that they needed, plus all the minerals and metals that are used for the industry. The Soviets stopped them, but you see the Soviets also inherited this land, and it has thousands of years of history, very unusual places. Probably remnants of the so-called Hyperborea civilization of the north. There are lakes with false bottoms, gigantic structures that cannot be explained, observations, something like observatories of the ancient times. And the Soviet KGB, for example, was very much interested in this piece of land. And I'll get into this. Back in the 1920s. And it's still there. I hope we don't know the precise location, because what happens is that the tourists, they find out and they go and start destroying things. But the lakes, that lake and a few others, are sacred to the local Sami people. And I've talked to them about the research and what's what people find there. Now, Lake Baikal, I was asked to talk about Baikal, and I will. This is in the east of Russia. In 1982, there was an interesting case of local Soviet military commanders finding out that at the bottom of Lake Baikal there are humanoid creatures working on whatever was their mission, and without using anything like breathing apparatus, about 9 feet tall. And they tried to capture them, and a number of Soviet frogmen died because of that, because they were thrown out of deep water, and they couldn't be saved. And so the order went down to the Soviet armed forces, do not attempt to do it any other bodies of water, because we know that there are other cases. There was even an order from the Soviet, a brochure from the Soviet engineering forces, military forces, describing visits from the UFOs and USOs into the lakes of other Soviet territories. It's a very unusual place, Baikal, and keep, you know, if you can, keep your eyes on the research coming to that area, or news, because they're finding more and more at the bottom of that lake. Unusual lake. There may be ancient tunnels. That's more of the esoteric knowledge, but there is persistent rumors of ancient tunnels going to other parts of the world. And I did a research of the Indian Mahabharata, ancient writings and analysis, and I talked to Indian scientists because you can find information about battles from ancient Indian history, where demons, so-called demons and so forth, who lived underwater, very vivid descriptions of powerful weapons and submarines and so forth. While some of the information leads us to Lake Baikal and other areas. Very interesting research. I had confirmation that this case really did take place, not just one source. There was a well-known Soviet writer, a very decent man, by the way. He did not have an easy life, but he spoke perfect Chinese, and I believe he was one of the interpreters who helped Khrushchev during his visits to Red China. Well, he knew quite a lot, and he was a very curious person himself. And in 1986, he happened to be in the area of Lake Baikal. He could not know about this case because it was forbidden even to talk about this in the Soviet Union. But he talked to the local people, and they told him, like 4 years ago when they were fishing, they saw this Soviet frogman being thrown out from the waters of the lake. So he wrote it down, and then in the later years he found out more about this history. And if we speak about lakes in Central Asia, one of the best areas for ancient astronaut theory confirmation, we'll get into that. Lake Issyk, in itself, it's a very mysterious lake. This is maybe where Genghis Khan is buried, but for sure, some of the treasures of the Nestorian Christians and the Templars are in that lake. And some other civilizations that go back thousands or more years are being found. You know, archaeological expeditions find stuff there. And UFOs have been persistently present in that area. And there are very interesting petroglyphs that are being found there. So that's another area to keep an eye on. In Ukraine, this is some of the interesting photographs, because Crimea, it's like a magnet to UFOs. And also there are remnants of some of the more ancient ruins in the Soviet Union. But you have to be careful, because people now learn how to make money, and they make false ancient ruins. You know, they want to make a living, but at the same time they destroy something more ancient or create false ruins. That happens too. This was very interesting. While Ukraine had submarines back in 2006, this was observed in the Black Sea. And I'm glad that sightings still go on, and there are at least some people who still do research. But Black Sea is a very prominent area in the USO phenomenon, and I know that Ballard, James Ballard, has been very much interested in that part of the world. There may be ruins of ancient cities that prior to the deluge in the Bible, and I'm sure there'll be more. As our technology develops, there'll be more findings, if not limited by international conflicts, I should say. Again, this is the same area where the submarine sighted the underwater object. In other years, 1979, I told you about that year, well, there was a very interesting photograph of an object coming from the waters. I'm jumping around, but USSR was a huge land, and Russia is today, and you can see, I just want to show you all the aspects and some of the most interesting areas. Keep an eye on the Arctic Ocean, because we know today that there may be conflicts over the possession of the minerals in the Arctic Ocean, Canada is not happy about Russian expansion, and Russia is doing all it can to bring forces back to the Arctic. But we'll talk more about real conflicts or not. What I do want to tell you that Stalin was very much interested in the Arctic. He created bases which were mothballed, I should say. Nobody actually used them. And Nazi Germany was very much involved too when they were good friends with the Soviet Union. Nazi ships were going to the Arctic, trying actually to intercept the British ships on the other side of the world in the Pacific Ocean. But then, when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany became enemies, Nazis never left the Arctic. People are still finding remnants of the very well-built German fortification in the permafrost and elsewhere. But there is more than that. And for some reason, they are very much attracted, just like the Soviets are, and USOs and UFOs, to the Arctic. Well, Russia today, I don't know if the presence of the minerals justifies the military spending that is being done, so there may be something else that attracts them there. What's interesting is that in the 1970s, all of a sudden there was a powerful plan put in motion to fortify the Arctic. Again, they built bases and then they abandoned them, but to the point that they can be revived at any moment. So it's like something they were getting ready to do. And it's the Soviet territory, so they were not looking to get anybody else's territory at the time. So this is interesting. And some of the photographs I will present that come from Russia, very unusual objects in the sky. Now, this is something new, and I talked about it recently, but Mariana Trench, it has nothing to do with the Soviet Union, right, or Russia. It has to do everything with Guam. It's only about 400 kilometers away from Guam. It's one of the most unusual places and secret places we have on our planet. And it's a very long depression, I think about 12 kilometers at the bottom of the sea. There were two manned vehicles or vessels that actually reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench, one in 1960 and one James Cameron. And only recently, because of Russian sources, we found out that the 1960s expedition sighted a USO down below. It's a dark world. It's a world that doesn't depend on the sun. There are biological life forms that have never seen the sun but exist and thrive, and it's a different process that keeps them alive. It's very interesting. I have made a presentation on my video channel. What's interesting to us is that according to the Russians, and this was the only place that came up with that report, there was an expedition to the area by Americans, they said. And the scientists were trying to put some equipment down below, and they were interfered with by whatever entities down below. That the steel cable, NASA-built steel cables, were almost cut off, and the equipment was saved. But the expedition itself, it wasn't just the American expedition. I found out. I did some research. It was in 1978, and aboard that ship, Glomar Explorer, Glomar Challenger, because there were two Glomar ships. There were Soviet scientists and others. It was a joint expedition, like you will see in my other stories and episodes. It's always at the top, no matter how bad the relations are, Soviets and the Americans working together, trying to, I don't know, to solve problems or to create more problems, but to get, definitely, to get down and, or to, up to the sky, to Mars and so forth, but always working hand in hand. And I am amazed at how much cooperation there is, whether with the space program or like here. And Mariana Trench, it will be an ongoing story. Guam, with the U.S. Navy base, functioning there for many years, was always visited by Soviet submarines, but at the same time there were very interesting cases of UFO sightings. And I know a young journalist who did a whole coverage of what happened there. He now lives in Hawaii, and if anybody is really interested in that, I can always put him in touch with the researchers. Very interesting. To me, what was unusual that in 1981, all of a sudden, American submarines were pulled away from the Guam base. This was right while the Cold War was the hottest. And yet, despite of Soviet visits to the area, for some reason, U.S. Navy decided to remove the base, very well-functioning base there. Something was going on in that area from, I would say, from 1978 on to maybe late 1980s. And this, as I told you, with the Soviet USO research, government sanction, also ended all of a sudden about the same time, maybe a few years later. So we're still trying to find out, if we can. Now, Yakutia, that's one of the most amazing parts of Russia. It's a permafrost land, full of diamonds, full of mineral resources, and a lot of mysteries. There are lakes like Labenkir that has unusual life forms inside, maybe like Loch Ness, but less people know about it. And Yakutia is very hard to reach. Most of it is also off limits, not all, but limits to the foreigners or just those who control the diamond fields and the gold fields. They don't want to see people from the outside. To me, what's interesting is that in Yakutia, and I'll get to it, there are remnants, used to be, of the long-forgotten civilization, advanced civilization, including strange objects embedded in the permafrost. And when the Soviets were changing nature and were building up reservoirs and mines, they covered them up with water, a few of them, not all. And those people who had visited in the past areas of these embedded objects, they suffered from radiation disease. Very unusual story. And there is more about Yakutia, much more. And I'll continue writing about it too, but in my books I mention it because I keep finding more information. When we start looking at the UFOs and USOs, we can see how ancient people would describe what they see on rock carvings, and you can see depictions of the spaceships, or at least this is what some people interpret, and I agree with them. This is in the Altai Mountains, this is in the east. Well, in the Ural Mountains, one of the most interesting areas in Russia, the Ural Mountains contain a lot of paranormal history. One of them is the findings of the nanotechnology objects, and I know who has them. I talked about it on Ancient Aliens, but besides that, I know scientists who have them, but nobody really studies them, and that's unusual because going back more than 100,000 years, I would say about 300,000 years, it's like there's a whole area where something like a perceived explosion took place and scattered around all these objects that geologists keep finding now. This is something that we only started producing recently in our own technology, yet it's found in the Ural Mountains. So again, this might have been a site of the long forgotten civilization that we can't even dream, we can't even imagine what it was. Look at this. This was said to be from about 300 million years ago. The people who found it, Cosmopoisk, I use a lot of their stuff too. I'm in touch with the leader of the group for many years, Vadim Chernobrov. He's a serious guy. He is a scientist, a writer, a fearless person. And he's trying to find solutions, let's say, to questions of paranormal history all over the world. Well, this is what they have. But, scientists, bureaucracies, they're not interested in studying this. So it's up to people like him. This is from the northern Russia. This is very interesting. One of the lakes that I told you about, it depicts landings of the spaceships, according to some scientists. Very interesting. Now this, we go to Kazakhstan. Those are petroglyphs from Tamgala area. There's much more, but it's being interpreted as being an alien being. Maybe this is not so, but you can see, I believe it's a mammoth down below, and the sun head man. If you ever happen to be in that part of Kazakhstan, very interesting area, they have Nazca-like lines all over. And, you know, just pilots who are flying in that area reported very complicated lines, but it's not being talked about much. But it's in Kazakhstan, and there is more. And in Ukraine, this is where my wife is from, they also found very interesting spheres, just like in Central America, that nobody knows where they came from, yet they exist. And, you know, local people, they just live by them. They don't question it, but no one knows where they came from. Uzbekistan, just not long ago, I did a presentation. Look at this. This is the Zarafshan Desert, the Red Sand Desert, and one of the most interesting areas in Kazakhstan too. Back in, I would say, 1990, some of the ufologists who had a desire to study, and they put their funds together, they went on an expedition, and because of them, archaeologists started coming to that area and doing research. Very unusual, this is just some of them, depictions of alien beings. There is a city, an ancient city, there are many lost cities in that area of Uzbekistan. Because of invasions, they had the Mongols, they had the Arabs, they had other civilizations coming in and out, and usually destroying what was already intact. But not that long ago, this city was found. Very unusual image of a circular city. Well, I'll show you something from the Ural Mountains that was discovered by archaeologists, an ancient observation and more. And as very similar to Stonehenge in many aspects, based on what scientists involved in the research found out. But two almost identical cities, thousands of kilometers away. That's recently all of in Karabakh area in the Caucasus Mountains. It's claimed by Azerbaijan and Armenia too. So it's not that easy to do research in a military zone. People started finding out unusual stone discs that are shaped like UFOs, like some of the discs that are being seen all over the planet. And my research about the so-called Dyatlov Pass murders, I'm being asked about it. I always bring up the information I have collected about this so-called golden woman. To put it in briefly, it was a celestial robotic-like being that was reported all over Eurasia, and people worshipped her. And this is not esoteric. The powers that she had are just like the infrasound weapons that are being used today. Well, I kind of found out the area where she might be, or it might be today, based on the research that I did. And we'll get to that 1959 case, but remember, this is the Ural Mountains, and this is one of the mountains. You cannot go there. People who do try to come close, and locals tell them do not do it. Many of them become very sick, horrible headaches, ear aches, and more than that. Everything that the infrasound can cause, it happens. Now, Arkaim, I told you about the circular city in Uzbekistan. Well, this is Arkaim, one of the most unusual findings in Russia. And it's an ancient civilization that built it, circular walls inside and out, very unusual construction. We don't know who they are. There are people today in Russia that say, well, they're ancient Aryans, they're ancient race that Russians come from. There's no proof. But what's interesting to me is the similarities between Uzbekistan and that area. They also found a grave 2 years ago of a woman, a female who was buried. She has a very elongated head. I didn't put the photographs here, maybe I should have, but it's a very similar to what aliens are supposed to have in some of the reports that we have. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it. Since we speak about ancient astronauts and possible hypotheses, in the Caucasus Mountains, there are areas of the so-called dolmen, structures that were built by unknown people. They say dwarf-like beings that came from the sea and built them. It's impossible to put them together with our technology because some local leader, I don't want to curse or anything like that, decided to take apart this dolmen, and they used the heaviest equipment they had, and they broke it apart when they couldn't put it together again. The monolithic stones and the precision they were put together, nobody knows. Some say, well, maybe it's the ritualistic place for them to come and dream and do something else. We do not know. Maybe it was a place of worship or something else. People say that there's unusual energy coming from that place. It has to be confirmed, but I would say thousands of them in a more or less small place, I think 500 kilometers. This is from Ukraine. Look at the treasures found in a part of Ukraine and the depiction of the ancient being. It's almost just like the astronauts today. I hope when the Ukraine has more money for research, there'll be more substantial research of this treasure trove, as they call it. It's very interesting. In the northern Russia, just like in Sweden and a few other places, there are so-called labyrinths. Very unusual structures going back about 4,000 or 5,000 years. Some of them are called Babylons. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows why they're called Little Babylons. But that's the local name. And I study Crete for many years. I've studied Minoan civilization for my own reasons. And I got to tell you that there are coins going back to ancient Crete that have the same depictions of objects. In the Northern Europe, even Britain, I believe, and Sweden, people say that those mazes could be explained as roadways or paths to another side of the world or another universe. But I don't think the local people in Russia today know where they came from. And I hope they are protected because there are too many tourists now. What's interesting to me is that I read a book by a Soviet archaeologist who was very much into studying of this phenomenon, and his friend, who was a physicist, came over, and when he looked at one of the labyrinths, he told him that this is just as a depiction of a very complex aerial antenna that he would create. And if we go back again, area not that far away from where the labyrinths are, this is the site of the supposed Hyperborea civilization. What's interesting to me is that the KGB was very much interested in the years when it did study anomalous phenomena, and this is one of their researchers, Barchenko, who went to the area to study the phenomenon is when people become like zombies, trance-like state that local people were put in, and you could command, you can do anything with them. And of course, Soviet government was interested to find out how to get their hands on this weapon, so to say. But there were some very interesting expeditions, and he did find ruins of ancient advanced civilization. I mentioned a little bit about it. And the top Soviet KGB persons were in touch with, were in charge of the program. But they studied more than that. They studied shamanism, they studied UFOs, or whatever they described as UFOs. They tried to get into Tibet, It all ended when Stalin, during the Stalinist purges. Stalin destroyed all of that, but the files have disappeared officially of the sanctioned, KGB sanctioned research back from 1920s, 1930s. And it's very interesting what they really found, because it was a well-funded program. When we go back, and I'm jumping around, but when we go back to time, if you remember Antonio Banderas, about 20 years ago, there was a movie, the 13th Rider, I think. Warrior. Thank you. This was the Arab diplomat from Baghdad who went to see the Muslim lands in what's today southern Russia and to re-establish contacts with the local population. Well, he was an excellent observer. And he did find, and it was in 1922, in one of the Volga regions, he observed aerial battle that went on for hours. And he and his people were afraid. They started praying, and the local people were laughing and said, "Do not be afraid, we see it all the time." It was an excellent depiction. And the only place I could find the Russian translation of the book was in Tatarstan, because in Russia, they don't publish it. It's not, he didn't like, he described local Slavs as not to be clean people, so, you know. But that's ancient times, and, you know, in the movie it was different. In the movie they talk about Vikings, but very interesting, and I hope there'll be an English translation, because you can find out a lot about the civilizations, ancient Muslim and other civilizations from that period. Interesting observations. Interesting time. If we go back to the Kuril Islands, or let's say the Devil's Triangle, which is not too far away from the Sea of Okhotsk, which I keep mentioning, and the same story of the Japanese, well, she wasn't Japanese, she was a female that arrived in Japan on this unusual circular boat. She was red-haired, I remember the description, and she clung to a box. She wouldn't let it go. Local people couldn't speak to her, she couldn't speak to them. She tried to land in a few places in Japan, but every time she was sent back. And it happened in 1813, not that long ago. And there are people who still try to investigate this case, and one of them, like I said, pointed to a small island in the Soviet Kurils, Russian Kurils. And this is Japanese depiction of UFOs from the Middle Ages. That's interesting. This is just one of the recent reports I've received. There is a lake in the Khakassia area of Russia. They found gigantic, you can see them, underwater plates. Who knows who made them? But when they did analysis, they found space-age alloys. And this is maybe from a year ago. It's a lake. And maybe someday we'll find out more, but look at the structures around. And you know, the plates go all the way to the bottom of the lake. Nobody knows who created them when. And Georgia, I highly recommend. It's one of the most beautiful countries, and if you like food, you like Georgian food. Believe me, it's unusual. But the civilization goes back thousands of years. They, you know, they were there before the Romans and others. Well, they have this very interesting picture. I don't think it's, I think it was actually wiped off. But I have this photograph still. And this is, as you can see, the UFO is right there. And it's one of them, and the people are looking in awe by the crucifix. And this is from Ukraine. Allegedly, this is a UFO. Could be. And, but that's the image, and this is from the 19th century. If we go back to some other areas, for example, in Georgia, you can see another UFO on this picture, and the other one is from Kosovo, Eastern Orthodox monastery, depicting UFOs. What could they be if they're not? Some scientists would say, no, they're not UFOs. What are they, jellyfish flying in the sky? I don't know what else can it be that you can explain it. Or this is Ukraine, a well-known manuscript. You know, this is about Kiev, the city I'm from. Also, Some of the reports from ancient Russia about the appearance of second sun and other objects in the sky. In 1663 there was a very interesting case, and we have to thank an observer who had enough knowledge and drive to write down the report. A UFO came, a gigantic one, out from nowhere, over the lake, and it had biophysical effects on the body of the water and the people around it, because they tried to row close to it in a boat, and you could see remnants of the effects, and the fish was scared, and the water turned I think it was like rust-like film on the surface of the water, and that monastery, of course, is still in existence. And Russian state archives have this story. In Ukraine, where I'm from, people are more relaxed, as you can see, and more carefree. And they're writing a letter to the Turkish Sultan to leave them alone. And they've imbued a lot of Ukrainian vodka, and happy. But whatever they do, they couldn't escape attention of UFOs, whether in 2010. Or before, because there were UFOs in the area sighted. And the Kazakhs even fired their guns at one of them, trying to scare it, because it was hovering over their territory for about a month. And very interesting. Some of the pictures from some pillars out of nowhere, not pictures, but drawings, gigantic pillars rising over city Mogilov. This is not the Arctic area, so I don't know how else I can explain it. In 1892, now this is something that I should be proud about, and the people from the former Soviet Union, Russian Empire, that in 1892 there was a meeting of the Russian Technical Society to discuss numerous reports of UFOs, just like reported today. Same objects, triangular, spherical, disc-like, all over Russian sky. So this was before 1947. See, the Russians did it before. They were worried enough to study and discuss this phenomenon. I don't need to explain. You know UFO history. You know what 1908 Tunguska object was. But we're getting more and more information, hopefully, about it. No fragments were found. If anybody tells you there is anything that somebody found, no. We still don't have any fragments of the object that supposedly crashed in Siberia. Most interesting reports, it was intercepted. There were two objects. And one intercepted the one coming to destroy the Earth and took it out. And for the explanation, we may have to go back to ancient Yakutia, and I did, I talked about it. There was, allegedly, there is an embedded base that takes out enemies of our planet when the time comes. For going back thousands of years. And I have it in my books. It's very interesting. Yakutia is an incredible place. This is from the research of the Tunguska phenomenon, and the person who was very much active in it, and I'm sorry, but he perished in a very bad way. He was an inmate of the Nazi concentration camps when he went to defend his country during the war. But before, in the 1940s, he was the one, Kuril, who pushed the research, and because of him we know what's going on. We still don't know what really happened, but we will, because the effects of an explosion or implosion or intercept are still felt in Russia too. Some of the reports from 1914 look at the depiction of the UFO, how people have described it. This is well before any modern time. I present information as much as I can about this person, who was also later an inmate of Soviet concentration camps. Very brave person, who in his youth, before the Soviet Union existed, he traveled to Turkey and other places, and in the Vatican he was given ancient manuscripts which described what we call ancient astronauts and encounters in antiquity. And he wasn't afraid to speak about it later when he was a professor in the Soviet university. and talked to his students, and one of them published an article about it. So I dug more and I found a little bit more about this person. Very interesting person. This is from 1930s from Crimea. The postcard depicts a UFO. Now, this is also somewhat recent research. I already showed you what they found in the Karabakh area. Well, this is from Russia. You know, they're doing excavations and they're finding all of a sudden unusual discs that look like, some people say like UFOs, but they also find the same in China. Almost the same. And nobody knows who put them there and why. In my YouTube channel, I talked about a very unusual discovery in the Soviet Union before World War II. And it was an ancient map of Mars that got to Armenia, most likely from the Alexandria Library. It only shows one moonlet of Mars. Phobos is not there. It shows demise. And this is supposedly an Egyptian map. And this story, it's a complicated story. The KGB was involved and somebody took the map without permission and allegedly returned it, and we know where the map is kept, it's just getting to it. But very unusual case. And there were confirmations from other parts of the world, even from nearby Georgia, of this map and what was recorded in it. But only one moonlet. Phobos wasn't there. Putaran is an area in northern Russia. It's an amazing area because there is an object. I don't have it here, but there is an object in one of the craters, metallic, gigantic object that moves around. Getting there, it's almost impossible physically, but scientists do get there, and there is no way to describe it. It's at the very bottom of the crater. It's a cylindrical, gigantic object, metallic, and it's moving about. What it is, nobody knows. There was no Soviet military presence there, no bases or anything like that. They wouldn't need it. In 1938, there was another very unusual case when a gigantic cloud appeared from nowhere, and it moved at incredible speed over Siberia. And then there was darkness for an extended period of time. No one can explain this case. Some of the anomalous zones in Russia, as you can see all over, I mentioned some of the places. And of course, people like to ask me about KGB, and so it was the Soviet military that was really involved in the research. The KGB, after the 1940s, didn't want to be bothered, but the people were so much accustomed to sending informant reports to the KGB that if they see anything in the sky, they would send it down to the KGB and they have to keep the files. At least this was the official excuse, and they did release some of the files in 1991. Very interesting information. The Red Army, there were constant observations of UFOs going back, I would say, to 1920s. And some of them we have good photographs and images. Even just like here, Foo fighters in the Soviet Union, there were observations of UFOs over military battlefields, and in Poland too, and wherever the Soviet army advanced to take out Nazis, they couldn't explain what those fiery spheres are and where they came from. They just accepted what they saw, but there was no explanation. But in the 1940s, there were more reports of gigantic cigar-shaped objects over the Soviet Union, and you can see some of the archives. The 1953 case, very interesting because it shows over the taiga region, taiga, dense forest, secluded area. There were concentration camps all around. 1953, gigantic object is splitting into smaller objects. And the biophysical effect on the observer was incredible. It's horrible. You barely survived. The KGB troops were in the area. They ran away, but they told him, you keep observing. You tell us what's going on. And later they confiscated his camera and so forth. But
was a very unusual case because the Soviets finally fired on that gigantic cylindrical object, and they lost, I think, 3 or 4 airplanes as a result. You look, I would say, 26 years later, 1979, about that time, secluded area of the Pacific Ocean, Soviet naval intelligence reports the very same object or identical object, very same phenomenon, splitting into smaller pieces. Incredible. Some of the encounters by, again, Crimea, very interesting and well-known Soviet airman, pilot. He reported an unusual solid ray. He almost crashed his airplane because it came from nowhere. The UFO shooting down a solid ray. And it's still an inexplicable incident. Some of the Mongolia, you know, I wish people would know more about that part of the world, because Mongolia, first of all, has secrets in its sands going back tens of thousands of years or more, and remnants of ancient civilizations. And we'll get to it more, but there were also, the Soviets, of course, were present in Mongolia as a friendly military force, and China was next door, and they saw very interesting objects in the sky. Couldn't be Chinese, because the Chinese were also interested, you know, on their side of what's coming from the Soviet Union. So somebody was sending, and I don't think this were the Americans too. Some of the observations of UFOs and drawings of what they had seen, fiery spheres coming from nowhere, triangular objects crossing path of Soviet airplanes. In the Chechen wars, there were a number of UFO sightings right over the areas of the most vicious battles. And you can see the Russian soldiers taking pictures and reports of UFOs. Now the KGB, this is the files that were released in 1991. This is very interesting. And I know that George Knapp and Brian Gresh later brought out files, but not the 1991 ones. This is the so-called blue folder. And if you read the reports were incredible. It's still inexplicable. And Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, was very much interested in UFOs. We found out that he had a file on his desk. Okay? And every day there were top reports from the Soviet UFO research program that I mentioned before were placed in that file. He was a very smart and devious man. And, he was too smart. And because of him, I think Hungary still suffers, but also because of people like him, we found out more about UFOs. So, 1978, I will always mention this year because some of the most strangest cases came from that year. And also, when we go back to Mariana Trench, this is based on my research, is when they actually try to get samples from down below, put down the equipment, and something down there almost destroyed the equipment, and they had images of gigantic beings swimming around. Same year, 1978. Kapustin Yar, this is a Soviet testing ground, Cosmodrome, and you may hear reports about the so-called Area 51 under the underground. It's not true. Kapustin Yar doesn't have anything like that because Russian ufologists went there and studied it. But there are other interesting things. UFOs were always present during Soviet military tests. And they knew this were not the Americans. The Setka secret program, we obtained documents from it, incredible scientific documents describing, and this is only 5%. 95% is hidden away. The real juicy details we don't have because they're still state secret in Russia. Some of the reports we were able to obtain, and that's incredible. By the way, the local population would also write to the newspapers about objects they would see in the sky, for example, and the newspapers were obliged to send such letters and reports to the people in charge of the Setka military program. It was a well-coordinated, unprecedented UFO research. Nothing like that took place in the United States, we know that. China has its own history and ufology, and they're more active, and they actually, I think, encourage people to study UFOs, but even they did not have that much collected information. And some of the top Soviet institutes were involved in the UFO, USO research, but you need to understand, most of the scientists didn't want to have anything to do with this, for their own reasons. And they were uncomfortable, there was always ideology over them, and they think, well, maybe today it's, they encourage us and tomorrow they will punish us for doing that. Other reasons, it's the military people who were very much active in the UFO, USO research and collected a lot. And this was the case that very much interested Andropov, also 1978, and he personally authorized research for that case, and it came from the Setka program files. Some of the UFO pictures that I have that you can see, also 1978 Ukraine, hard to explain. Now, 1982 almost was the start of World War III, because in Ukraine there was a military silo with nuclear ballistic missiles, and a gigantic UFO appeared over them one day, October 4, 1982, and Moscow lost control. They couldn't stop the sequence when the missiles were about to be launched. I don't think it was that dramatic. I think it would take still about a few hours before they would be launched, but Moscow couldn't control for 15 minutes, couldn't do anything, because the UFO was hovering over and it took control over the missiles. But then it stopped. And I have reports, not only from the Setka program, that's something else, but I collected reports from the military people who had served in the area and are trying to exchange information about what they had seen. And the UFO was observed in several villages in the area. It was a gigantic object, still an inexplicable case. I think ABC did a story many years ago about it. There's an area in Russia where the military commanders begged that Setka program to come and help them because Soviet jets were being taken out from the sky by UFOs. This is one of the incidents where active UFO interference with flights of the airplanes and destruction of the airplanes. Also the very unusual case of the black cloud. I mentioned to you about the black cloud over Siberia. This was a smaller cloud that wouldn't move away, but when the airplanes went inside, they suffered, pilots suffered tremendously. It's like you go into another dimension. This city is in the Soviet Russian now Arctic area. Unless you are a Russian or a Belarusian, you cannot get there. It's off limits to the foreigners. And one of the most secretive areas because of the military minerals and precious metals they're digging out. You understand, I can't have all the photographs I have, it's state secret, but some of them we obtained. And this is the area where UFOs have been sighted. I'll show you something else that I did get recently from that area. Very interesting, constant presence of UFOs. This is another area, goes back to 1984, another observation by military people. And this small village in Russia is the site of the military, of the base where military attempted to communicate with UFOs, and it was very interesting. They put soldiers all over the field and made them do hand gestures, for example, raise their hands at the same time, all of them, and the UFOs in turn would flatten out, like, for example, change shapes, trying to, I guess, to show to Earthlings that they understand the signals and they are reacting. It came from more than one source, generals. And there is no reason for them to lie, they're not making money at them. Very interesting case. Now let's jump into the Soviet space program, because from the very inception it had UFO visits all over the skies. This was a Russian scientist and philosopher who pushed the research into space, very interesting person who himself observed UFOs in the Soviet Union, in the early Soviet Union. A very unusual person. You know, some are very proud of him. Some say he was just plain insane. We don't know, but he did his contribution to the space research, and out of respect, I have to show it. And he was very prominent in Russia, and he did observe UFOs back in 1935 himself. Korolev, the Stalin's UFO consultant and father of the Soviet space program, he was the one that Stalin called into Kremlin in 1947, put a pile of documents in front of him. Apparently, Soviet intelligence was very active in the United States and obtained a number of Roswell-related documents. And Stalin wanted to find out what is your assessment of such American and observations in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. What do you think the UFOs are? I need to know, I need your assessment. Are they enemies? Should we be afraid of them? What should we do? And Korolev and other top Soviet scientists basically told him, yes, they exist, but no, they're not enemies. We shouldn't be afraid of them. That's what we know. Some of the Soviet cosmonauts and people like Mariana Popovich, who was here, by the way, in Los Angeles in 1991, and I met her, and she gave me some of the documents related to the Phobos program, photographs, and we'll get to the Phobos program. But people who had observed UFOs and talked about them, maybe more than American astronauts did, to an extent. Incredible cases were reported. Observations from going back to the 5th expedition. It's a complicated one. I have it in some of my books. But the cosmonauts are still alive today. One of them is in politics. And whatever they had seen, definitely they had observed something into space. How complicated the cases, we still don't know. But it's there. Grechko, he says he doesn't believe in UFOs. But then he started believing after he saw this painting when he went to the United Kingdom, I guess. And you can see, this is what struck him. But then he says that while we are sure that extraterrestrials visited us in the past, I'm sure that our cosmonauts did not see anything. Well, how is he sure that extraterrestrials visited us in the past? He's not the only one. Alexei Leonov says the same thing, virulently against confirmation of facts that Soviet and Russian cosmonauts observe UFOs today, but at the same time completely sure that we were visited in antiquity. Pavel Popovich was the same, and I always mention Pavel Popovich, the Ukrainian cosmonaut, or Soviet cosmonaut from Ukraine, let's put it that way, who helped very much UFO researchers in the Soviet Union when it wasn't fashionable to be studying UFOs. He went beyond. First of all, he observed a UFO himself while flying over Cuba on the way to the United States. And then he brought up a lot of Soviet cases, and he was active in the civilian government authorized UFO research program alongside the secret military program, because they were not satisfied with all the with all the information that was obtained. So they found a way to suck out information from the civilians and saying, well, we'll study what you report, but nobody knows the results of this program. However, we do know a little bit, and that's enough to make us amazed. And Pavel Popovich, who was very much sure about the existence of underwater bases in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, and he talked about South America. Well, he was also very much involved in the Soviet UFO program, provided protection, and he was one of the first cosmonauts. So you have that. Igor Volk died a few months ago, passed away. Very interesting cosmonaut who personally observed UFO down on the ground. They were on the way to a secret space research town, and he observed the UFO with somebody else. But what's interesting to me, because he didn't confirm it, but the case I always talk about, the so-called angels, which appeared aboard the Soviet orbital station when he was there, Salyut 7, with other cosmonauts, and some of them reported it years later because you couldn't do it during the Soviet times. Angelic-like beings, that's how they perceived them. Gigantic beings appeared out of nowhere aboard the space station. He was there too, but I don't recall that he talked about it. Cosmonauts, even we have some pictures of the UFOs over the spaceports, cosmodromes. One of the Soviet scientists mentioned that it felt like we are being observed, like we are being under a microscope constantly. Somebody is studying us, and they knew this were top Soviet space officials. Anytime there was a launch, almost anytime there was a UFO present. Some of the cosmonauts openly talked about UFOs, and very interesting. I have a presentation, video presentation about unusual impact of us being in space on Russian cosmonauts and visions that they have while in space. I'm sure we'll hear more and more about it when we explore it. But it's very interesting. Not just UFO sightings, but other phenomena. Still more cosmonauts who are not afraid to talk about UFOs. There was a very unusual case when a UFO actually saved a Soviet spacecraft that was about to be destroyed, and actually shepherded over them, like helped them while they were lying in the Altai Mountains, a few kilometers away from the Chinese border. They were afraid it would be captured by the Chinese. But there was more to that. Very unusual case. I think the cosmonauts already passed away, but they left enough information behind. Phobos. As I told you, to me I don't doubt anymore that the United States and the Soviet Union at the very highest levels, and probably Russia today, and China most likely, are exchanging information. Well, Phobos was the mission to Mars moonlet in late 1980s. It was actually 1988 when it was launched. In 1989, one of the probes came close to Phobos, and they tried to take experiments. They tried to shoot at the moonlet itself to get samples of the soil, I guess, and so forth. The probe was taken away by an object here, 25 kilometers. Okay? This was the last photograph that Phobos 2 sent before it was, I don't want to say destroyed, because it was taken out from Martian orbit and gone. But you know what? Several months later, for a very brief period of time, they received signals from it on Earth, and that's it, and no more. Professor Kudakov, I knew him. We exchanged a lot of information and letters. He was one of the top Soviet scientists in the missile program and the space research field. He was also under in the team of Korolev, and I mentioned him in his meetings with Stalin. Because of him, we know about that meeting. He was a well-educated person, and he knew quite a lot, not just about the missiles and so forth. And in 1988, he raised panic when he found out that there was this mission to Phobos, because he knew, like Buzz Aldrin does, that there is something on Phobos, something that doesn't want us there, and we shouldn't go there. And maybe that's why we keep losing space probes in Mars, but definitely Phobos doesn't invite us. And why I said the United States, from the very first moment that Phobos was launched, JPL was in touch with the Soviet Union. They knew everything was going on. They received information on an ongoing basis. And the Phobos itself was a creation of the international team of scientists. It wasn't a Soviet probe. The Russian scientists were involved, but that's about it. So not long ago, but 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we lost another probe, Russian, Chinese mission to Mars. ended in Earth orbit. And I'm not sure why, what happened, sabotage or just miscalculations, but the missions to Mars and Phobos are not very fortunate, as you can see. Back in the Soviet Union, and I remember as a kid, I was reading also some of the articles and so forth. They knew in the Soviet Union that Phobos is an artificial creation. Just like Jonathan Swift, I guess, knew when he wrote about Gulliver Travels and described the two very unusual moonlets of Mars. In the Soviet Union, they were sure. At least one scientist, Shklovsky, a very good friend of Carl Sagan, and sometimes, there are suppositions and hypotheses, but it was more than that. I don't know where this knowledge came from, but they were sure, scientists like him, that Phobos and Deimos are of artificial creation. That's, again, this is the last photograph. This is what Marina Popovich gave me. And Marina Popovich, she was the wife of Pavel Popovich, that very active Soviet cosmonaut who helped UFO research, a former wife. Well, she was active on herself trying to promote UFO research in the Soviet Union. Oh, by the way, this is something I wanted to talk about. Steve mentioned Bigfoot, and if you go to my channel, I have, I think, 3 videos about Bigfoot research in the Soviet Union. I'm very much into this in Russia. Well, Marina Popovich led one of the expeditions in 1984 to the mountains, Tian Shan Mountains, to look for the Bigfoot. It was packed with KGB people, former KGB military, scientists, and so forth, and others. And they also observed UFOs in that area. That's Central Asia, not too far from China. And it was very interesting research. She knew, she talked to the people in the Globkosmos, or a Soviet space agency, who told her they knew that Phobos too was destroyed, because they didn't know it actually came back for a while, but they knew that Phobos too was destroyed by alien civilization. A little bit more about Marina Popovich, and this is the failed Phobos Grund mission. But I know that the Americans and the Russians are building another mission right now based on the reports in media. And some of the people in the modern Russia, like this head of the Russian Space Forces, they have no doubts that UFOs exist. And some of the history I want to go to quickly to show you observations of UFOs, some of the available photographs. And of course we know that not all of the objects are real UFOs, but until we know otherwise, we have to assume. Some of the most recent photographs over the areas where ancient observations were taking place. Yakutia I already mentioned. I told you about those objects embedded in the permafrost. It's like dome-shaped structures. Those who visited and slept there, they were sick. It's like effects of a nuclear explosion somewhere in Japan, whoever in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, same effects. This is where some of the objects are now covered by water, but this is where they existed. And this is how they looked like centuries before. Not too long ago, because the territory wasn't conquered by Russia until, let's say, 17th, 18th century explorers. But there's a lot of strange phenomena in Yakutia, and I'll continue writing about it. Very unusual. Including the finding of it was a state secret in the Soviet Union for many years in Russia. They found impact diamonds, a whole field of them, more, enough to last for 3,000 years. Impact diamonds that people use not as jewelry, but for industry needs. And that's in Russia, and that's also in Yakutia. I already told you about the strange creatures found in the lakes of Yakutia. And again, some of the photographs. Now, this is the 1959 case that I told you about, the strange murder of a group of tourists, skiers who went to the area. There were movies made, and I'm sure you've seen some recently in the last few years. Nobody knows for sure what happened to them. There are many hypotheses. Maybe secret experiments, maybe launches of Soviet missiles, UFOs were sighted in the area, somebody said Bigfoot, you name it. But the way they died and the injuries found on the bodies of those young men, only after the autopsies were performed did people find out the extent of the injuries inside their bodies. But the skin was intact, orange-colored skin. After that, very strange area, very strange case. But actually, there were in later years there were similar cases there. Very hard to explain. I told you about my explanation based on my research, and there are some other people in Russia who study it. Still inexplicable, and I'm sure there'll be more about it later. I don't want to go into all the details, but even the people who were involved in the expedition had a very interesting background, and there is a theory that this was actually a KGB operation to remove American agents. A very complicated case, but UFOs were sighted, and the criminal investigation was so unusual, and so many people were pulled away from it. We don't know even how many bodies were recovered. There should be only 9, but apparently 11 bodies were recovered. So no one is sure about what really happened there, on that mountain of the dead, as they call it. Some of the observations of strange fiery sickles over Russia in 1950s, attacks. This case was very interesting. In 56, UFO actually attacked people in Kazakhstan, which is always full of paranormal phenomena. Well, there was an actual attack of a fiery disc on people down below. Some of them survived to tell about this. Because UFOs really, in the history that I have of the Soviet Union, Russia and so forth, don't attack people. It's like if you don't bother a shark, it doesn't bother you. Some people say, but not in this case. Some of the types of UFOs observed over the Soviet Union and Russia. Another case, 1961, Latvia, Soviet Latvia, Riga, a triangular object was all over the Soviet airfield and had very strange impact on people below. Khrushchev was interested in the case. And you can see some of the files and reports. 1976 was a very unusual case over the Baltic. There was a bolide, so-called, but it never went away. It kept coming back and back. And a report that I made about the area in Uzbekistan. We're going to go back to Uzbekistan. And Central Asia and all, is very interesting. I'll show you ancient findings in the deserts, but there are earthquakes. It's a very seismic area. And this is a recent UFO picture, I think from 2006. Well, during the 1966 earthquake in Tashkent, UFOs were observed. And those of you who study ufology should remember 1966 because we had the very same date. From 24, I would say, to 26 of April 1966, there were a number of UFO cases all over the eastern border of the United States. Some were reported. And I received the confirmation from somebody who actually was in Chicago at the time as a kid. He and his family observed that. And I want to bring your attention to 1966 because the very same date, the governor of Florida was flying in his airplane and there were the UFO appeared right in front of their plane and they had to change course. It's historical. And by the way, in 1966, future US President Gerald Ford kept pushing the United States government to have hearings about UFOs. I know people talk about other parts of the US UFO research history, but not many people talk about it. So I made a presentation about it on my YouTube channel, and I brought up as much information as I can. But in 1966, in other parts of the world and the United States, there was this wave of UFO observations. And the same happened in Uzbekistan, Tashkent. So you can see patterns, you can see everything is interconnected on our planet. Some of the UFO researchers who were not afraid to study UFOs but suffered because of it too. And the CIA was very much interested in Felix Ziegel, for example, as well. So there was always this spy game around UFO research. But you know what? When I spoke about Uzbekistan before, in my presentation I have reports now available to us from the CIA who had a station in Uzbekistan, and they had spies and informants down below, and the CIA was so much interested in their UFO reports, they kept questioning them more than once. And in 1947, as you know, this was a very momentous year for the UFO research. A lot of things happened. Well, in 1947 in Uzbekistan, there were observations of UFOs. Just like, you know, the expedition to Antarctica in 1947, Kenneth Arnold, and much more. So, 1977 was the unusual case, and because of that case, the Setka program took place. In 1977, there were launches of Soviet secret satellites, and at the same time, there were appearances of UFOs before, during, and after that period, including a gigantic jellyfish object over Petrozavodsk. So you had natural phenomena, military tests, and unnatural phenomena, UFOs. And no matter how much debunkers want to put down this case, it's inexplicable. But it scared the Soviet government enough to force them to create a UFO research program 1 year later. And this is just some of the interesting observations of UFOs. This is in northern Russia. Very unusual UFO, if you can see over Siberia in 1977, it has needles all over it. And it's a dark object, and it almost interfered with the plane course, airplane course. 79, also a very interesting year for the UFO research in the Soviet Union. Very unusual sighting of this object. It doesn't look like they knew if it would be a foreign intelligence satellite. Some of the unusual rays, objects that emitted rays over Moscow in 1980. A triangular UFO from central Russia. In 1996, when Chernobyl took place, in my research I found out that the effects of the explosion would have been much worse for Ukraine and Europe and everybody else had it not been for a UFO-like object that was seen over the area of the explosion, and the ray, that powerful energy ray that it used to diminish the effects of the explosion came from the UFO. Again, it's like a protective force over ecologically damaged areas in the Soviet Union. Reports from scientists who were on site during those days. That's another one. They kept coming, UFOs kept coming over the Chernobyl. Maritime province in Russia, not far from Japan, is full of reports. Height 611, this is the case I've talked about it, I had a book about it. Nobody knows what actually crashed in Russia on that date. I want you to know that this is where, let me remember, I believe the shuttle Challenger perished, if you remember, January 1986, the day before. Okay? The day before. I don't know how we can put connections, but the object that crashed on 6/11, this is height 6/11, that's how it's called, kept coming up and down. It didn't just crash. It was a very unusual object. It left behind fragments of technology that some scientists said could not exist on our present Earth. Some say, no, we have this technology since the late 1970s and we use it for our military purposes. But if it was a Soviet, what should I say, device that crashed, they would make it a zone of secluded, off-limits zone, but they didn't, because scientists had studied it on their own. If it was a foreign satellite, they would have made noise, immediate noise. But the Soviets are very quiet about this. And this case had a lot of strange aspects to it. Some of the findings there had been studied by Russian scientists, Soviet scientists, and others. And they said we cannot have technology of metals that vanish and reappear after spectral analysis. It's a complicated, I have the reports, I don't want to go into them right now, but it's a complicated case. It shouldn't be forgotten, and simply because in 1 year later, a whole fleet of UFOs visited that area and some other surrounding towns, and this is a forbidden area. You could not get in there during the Soviet times, and not easy to get today because of the plants and factories they have and developments that they do for military purposes. Well, the UFOs don't care about it. A whole fleet of them came over in 1987. Objects of different size and shapes, the local KGB recorded it, and scientists and just plain observers. And some of the objects flew to the mountain, to the height 611. So we still don't know what happened there. Unfortunately, Dr. Duzhilny passed away a few years ago, but he kept researching the area where he lived, and he found fragments of UFOs, but beyond that, because he had good friends with the, first of all, local military commanders and other scientists, they found fragments that go back to civilizations that millions of years ago. He claimed, and he brought some of those fragments to show to the laboratories. But you know what? There isn't that many people interested in the official scientific establishment. So you can bring as much as you want, but they will not study it. Some of the objects that he recovered, again, are most unusual. And he did find some laboratories to study them. And the scientists were amazed. In 1987, again, not far away from there, there were gigantic cigar-shaped and other UFOs slowly flying around the area. In 1987, the USSR was changing, perestroika, and so forth. So I'm not sure if, for example, the United States would spend money to build a cigar-shaped satellite to spy on the Soviets, But the Chinese are interested. The Chinese have very keen interest in this case, and the Koreans too. This is the so-called Voronezh case, very unusual case reported by children, so you can take it, with a kind of, did the case happen or not. To me, it's interesting, not too far away from there is the area which I mentioned before, of the military airfields where the flights of Soviet jets, test flights were interfered with UFOs, and some of the jets perished because of that, not too far away. So I don't know what really happened in 1989 in Voronezh, but it was a very interesting case, very vivid case. Some of the photos I received from local ufologists years later of the things that go on in that area. Again, this is another Russian town, and in 1989, also a very interesting year, they photographed strange signs that appeared in the sky all over the city, which cannot be explained. Nobody knows what is it, who put these writings in the sky. This is not chemical trails, this is something else. Ural Mountains, a favorite place for paranormal phenomena. They found a strange creature back in 1996. The Japanese were very much interested in studying it too. It came from nowhere, and then it disappeared, and the lady who was like a host to this creature then died in a car accident some years later. Very unusual case. It may be because the Ural Mountains had other incidents not related to ufology but related to Soviet bacteriological and other research. It might have been that this creature was the result of the Soviet secret experiments. Nobody knows. But they did exist, and this Alyoshenko or little Alexei, nobody knows what happened to him at the end. Again, Crimea, some of the most of the interesting photographs from the area. Central Asia has a wealth of UFOs, like I said, and we only know a little bit of the information. People don't always report them, and those that do, not always available to us. Some of the triangular UFOs over Russia. Some of the people involved, you know, this was well before Daniken and others. He was a Russian engineer, scientist, and you know, very pro-Soviet person. He was very much Soviet patriot. He was into ideology, but at the same time, he had very creative ideas. And he was the one that introduced this figure into von Daniken, I believe. Well, because of him, actually, there was a lot of interest in the Tunguska phenomenon, because he said that while he was in the United States, I believe in late 1930s, on the World Fair, he represented the Soviet Union, and he had good connections here as well. Well, after World War II, he was a military officer. He said he was traveling in a train, and then he imagined that, based on the knowledge about nuclear power, that whatever happened over the Taiga in 1908 was the destruction of an alien spaceship. And sometimes they say things and they have more knowledge than we know about, and we still don't know where it came from. But he obviously knew much more. He was well connected in the Soviet Union, and he actually helped young Russian UFO researchers like Chernobyl. And this is what he described. This is what he found out in ancient Japanese figurine that allegedly represents an alien being. This is one of the most prominent Russian researchers today, and a lot of my information is because of him, and he's very active. And Chernobyl too, he was actually the protege of the gentleman I just showed you, the older gentleman, who gave impetus to the UFO research. So you see things clicking together. In 1967, something unusual took place in the Soviet Union. It was like a breath of freedom, because scientists and military people joined hands and were able to appear on the Soviet television and urged local population, Soviet population, to send in their reports. It was like a small revolution. Okay? Some of the military people were very much interested in getting more UFO information, but this was quite unusual. You've not had it anywhere else. Appeal to the population, definitely not here, not in China, to collect UFO information. Well, this was crashed. I mean, the other people who did not like UFO information to be publicly acknowledged, they took care of those who came to the Soviet television, and they were disbanded. But people heard it, and reports came from all over the Soviet Union in 1967 about UFOs. It was a very unusual case. Some of the interesting photographs I want to go to show you, and depictions by eyewitnesses of UFOs over the Soviet Union. And again, it's remote areas, but also central Russia as well, like these ones. And as the technology improved, you could make more photographs and depictions. 1985 was a very interesting case. This is not far away from the Petrozavodsk, where in 1977 the jellyfish-like craft appeared over the city. A UFO was able to pull the train, interfered with the operations of a Soviet train, and took control, and for a while, and played with it, so to say. And this was recorded in a number of sources, and you know, of course, the train engineer almost lost his mind. You know, a UFO appearing from nowhere and taking control and so forth, but I've not heard about any other case like that elsewhere. Some of the gigantic beings reported. Gigantic beings is always interesting to me because of the so-called 9 feet long swimmers that I told you about in the Lake Baikal. And I had other reports from other parts of the Soviet Union and Russia about similar beings. And those are like crop circles. They also appear in Russia and Siberia and Ukraine, elsewhere. Some of the other photographs of the UFOs, you see, there was no Photoshop in those years, and the equipment wasn't that good. So, who would go through the effort to make false photographs in 1960s, 1950s? Of course, some of it is natural phenomena we cannot explain, but not all of it. This is from areas not too far from China. There are a lot of UFO sightings in those areas on the border with the Soviet Union and Russia and China. This is not that long ago. This is cigar shape that appeared out of nowhere over Moscow. In 2007, there was almost a collision between a UFO and a Russian airplane. This is a very unusual object. I'm not sure what it is, but it was filmed in a few areas over Russia. Ural Mountains, again, similar object. This was a reported cloud over Moscow. I think it has natural explanation, but there were a lot of noise about it all over the world. Again, the Nazca-like lines all over Central Asia, Karadal Mountains in Kazakhstan. I hope we see all of the depictions down below. Very unusual, but no one studied it. Some of the crop circles. Another cloud. Now this was no UFO. A lot of people claimed it was a failed test of the Bulava missile, but it was seen over Norway as well. See triangular UFOs. I'm trying to get something from the later years so you can see what people find in the sky. 2011 there were triangular objects all over, like a wave of objects all over Russia. A politician in Russia, and actually the former head of the World Chess Association Federation, he claims to be abducted, that he was abducted, and he was aboard of a gigantic ship, like as long as a football field. And he's one of the top politicians. I don't think he's anymore president of Kalmykia, but he's still very active. And he was into the United States a few times and a few other areas. And he's not shy. You can see who he's next to, and he's very outspoken. He's not insane, I'm sure people know him well. And this is the area that I told you about in the northern Russia. This is where the diamond field. I cannot have photographs, of course, of the diamond field, but that's in the area and of that crater. And the UFOs have been coming to the area for years, especially Khatanga. It's a village, I think, in the nearby Yakutia. And we have reports from the Soviet Meteorological Station about 1979 numerous sightings of UFOs. So this is official record. This is not some. Now this is one of the latest I got. This is Norilsk. This is the secret, forbidden area for the foreigners. Well, this was not very clear, but the photographs were taken in 2015. There's a very strange lake there too. And local guides took it, they sent it to me. Some of the researchers, and something I want to end presentation now before we get into questions with. Ivan Yefremov, if there were unusual people like Leonardo da Vinci, maybe a few others, he was one of them. He was a Soviet scientist, writer, author, philosopher, had very good friends overseas in UCLA, one of the famous professors, who said that Ivan Yefremov was a person out of bounds of time and space, and I think he was. After he died, you see, he wasn't well liked completely by the Soviet government because his vision of communism was different from theirs, And they knew it, and he knew much more than that. To the extent that they tried to to slander him, saying that he was a British agent. He was not. He was a Russian patriot. He was one of the top scientists who developed the field of geology there. He traveled to Mongolia, where he found something. I'm going to get into this. But when he died, the KGB in 1972, I was still in the Soviet Union too, and I read one of his books, many and other books, and this put an impact on me too, like on many other Soviet people. When he died, the KGB in 1972 raided his apartment and confiscated most of the things that belonged to him. They even wanted to take the urn with his ashes, but his wife was fighting them over it, virtually, And his case, the KGB case, contained 40 volumes, and they're still not classified. There is no more USSR. But his case is still classified, and there were rumors, and I think that was spread by a local Moscow KGB that he was an alien being. If you have a chance, and you can find his books now in English, The Land of Foam, for example, about ancient Egypt, and others. He knew so much about ancient civilizations, from Egypt on to China. By the way, he was in China too, and we'll get into this. And he had very interesting friends there. To the island of Crete, an ancient Minoan civilization. The knowledge of this man and the power and just the breadth of interest were incredible. He discovered the dinosaur bones in Mongolia, and he led some of the expeditions. They're very difficult expeditions, and they discovered more than that in Mongolia. And Mongolia in itself contains a lot of secrets that were mentioned by other people in the West, those who knew, but he was on site, he was there, and he touched things. He was in the Gobi Desert. And what they found in the Gobi Desert, he took the expedition one day to a certain location. He said, "Follow me." And they went, they drove, and they had very old vehicles, and you can see, doesn't matter. He drove them to a special location, and he says, "We have to dig here." And it wasn't an easy place to dig, but it was on the slope of a hill that was going down to a small river, actually. So they had to dig from the side, because they couldn't do anything from the top ground, because there were plates, one on top of another. Somebody put plates over a grave. They finally got to it, of a gigantic being, about 9 feet tall, who was buried who knows when, and his wrists were cut off. He had no hands. They were cut off. And Yefremov told his expedition to collect the bones, and they took photographs there, but it was not allowed to be published. And the bones and the findings were given to an archaeological expedition that happened to be in the area as well. And they disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. But it's eerie that he knew what to do and where to find. Something very interesting. One of the Soviet cosmonauts I described before, and the observations of UFOs, well, Grechko, I believe, who doesn't believe in the presence of UFOs, when he was in the sky over Mongolia, all of a sudden they saw an image of a gigantic person appearing, not far from them. And they cannot explain this image, just like some cosmonauts cannot explain strange noises in their heads when they are in space. And I talk about it in my other presentations and so forth. But that, over Mongolia, very interesting. I don't know what correlations we can make, but Ivan Yefremov, I cannot in 5 minutes tell you all I know about him, but I've published some articles. Even Pravda, after so many years, Pravda published him, I would never guess that I would be, part of their journalists. They published some of my articles, and I'm laughing, It's a personal to me. But anyway, Pravda published that too. Now, the remains of that giant, which was discovered in an expedition, they were given to a Soviet professor. That's as much as I found out. But what happened to the bones, nobody knows. Is it a state secret? Could be. By the way, something very interesting, I talk about my video presentations. In the 1930s, a whole number of Soviet scientists were executed to the purges and so forth, but even before the main purges of the middle 1930s. Many of them were Egyptologists, and we still do not know why they killed them. Only because they were part of the old Russia? Educated? No, that's not good enough. Something in their research, Egypt and others of antiquity, scared the government to the point that they were exterminated. So, just to add it. In 1959, Ivan Yefremov went to China. You can imagine what China was like under Mao at that time. And there he was shown a bronze globe from the 1st century. Okay? As far as we know, Common Era, AD. It showed images of constellations that could only be observed from southern hemisphere. Ancient Chinese knowledge is incredible, only know so much. But they knew about Yefremov, and they knew how to contact him, and he knew how to be in touch with them. So there is something in this world that we don't know enough of, but when I read his books, and you can read many of them now in English, you will find descriptions of ancient technology. For example, medical technology that existed in China a few thousand years ago, I believe, where you could put a patient in between two mirror, glass-like objects, and the doctors of the time would see any ailment that that person would have. There were more. He talked about ancient lenses found in laboratories of other parts of the world, and he talked a lot about Minoan Crete. There was something there that attracted him. And to end it all, the death form from Mongolia, Yefremov, as far as I know, was the first person to describe it, because apparently he saw it, and he wrote a novel based on that. He knew what the death form is like, and it killed, I believe, one of the members of the expedition. So he was one of the people. So that's my presentation.
Well, that was a spectacular presentation.
Thank you.
Full of detailed information. Loved it. I loved it. We always reserve a little bit of time for Q&A, so if anybody, we have a mic here? Okay, we have a little mic. It's a little mic, but we invite you guys who want to ask a few questions. Come on up.
Thank you very much. It was excellent.
Thank you.
I want to know, you talk about the United States cooperation with the USSR. You didn't mention anything about Apollo 20. Do you know anything about that?
No, I've heard some. Let me see. I've heard a few things, but no. What I know, for example, is what I mentioned, is that the Soviet Union is quite certain that there were American landings on the moon, and their representative Cosmonaut Leonov said that we knew every moment what the Americans were doing, and we kept an eye on them and on the lunar landings. But that's it.
Because it was supposed to be a joint venture that they went up there and they found all the mining equipment on the dark side. And if you look on YouTube, there are some pretty interesting videos. Whether they're legitimate or not, that's why I wanted you to...
Well, I'll tell you something else, what I describe in my books. A reported incident, the Soviets had a moonwalker on the moon. And there are legends that actually there were 2 volunteers that were sent to operate the moon. On the moon. So you hear all those stories, and there are many secrets, related to the moon, but I don't have confirmation of what you asked.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, guys? I have one question for you, Paul. In the Phobos picture, the Phobos 2 mission, and the last picture it took, you see a amorphous glob and then a line. What are those two things that we're looking at in that photo?
For sure, the object, I know about the object itself, the 25-kilometer object. This was taken, the photograph that was taken of the object just before the probe disappeared.
Okay, so is the line the object? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes.
And that's 25 kilometers. And what is the other thing? Is that Phobos?
I think so.
Okay, all right. Any other questions, guys? Okay, well, Paul has his books in the back. I think he's a spectacular researcher, and it was a great talk. Really appreciate it, Paul. Thank you.